F-15E, Automatic Flight Control System, AFCS, provides 4 flight aids for the pilot. Control Augmentation, CAS, for the roll, pitch, and yaw, flight axis. Terrain Following Coupling, for use with the Lantern TF radar. Spin Recovery Aid, which helps recovery by disengaging CAS and selecting full mechanical roll authority, whenever an excessive yaw rate is detected. And autopilot modes, both basic and coupled with navigation sources. This training mission will focus on the autopilot subsystem, as the terrain following will be the focus of a separate mission, while CAS is part of the basic flight control and does not require dedicated training. The autopilot basic modes are attitude hold and pitch attitude hold, heading hold, altitude hold, and altitude select mode, barometric or radar. The navigation coupled modes are inertial navigation steering, heading steering, ground track steering, course steering, and TACAN steering. The last 3 are not yet implemented during the early access stage of the module. Press spacebar to begin the training. For the autopilot to work, it is necessary that all 3 CAS switches be set to on. Press spacebar once you have checked that CAS is enabled. The autopilot button on the UFC enables or disables the autopilot. The A key is binded to this button by default. Use whichever you prefer, but don't enable it yet, while I'm explaining the different modes. Upon pressing the AP button, the autopilot will be enabled on one of its basic modes, depending on the attitude of your aircraft at the moment of pressing it. 1. Pitch attitude hold mode, if the pitch is between 0 to 45 degrees when the AP button is pressed. The UFC top line will display APHDG. 2. Heading hold mode, if the bank angle is lower than 7 degrees. The UFC top line will display APHDG. Please note that both pitch attitude and heading modes can be enabled at the same time, though the top line shows APHDG in both cases. 3. Attitude hold mode, if the bank angle is between 7 and 60 degrees. The UFC top line will display APATT. Press spacebar to continue. Let's give it a try. I have unpaused the mission, increased throttle to maintain a speed of 400 to 450 knots and trim the aircraft for level flight. Note also that push button 9 of the UFC displays the current state of the autopilot, AP off. Good, now pull the stick a bit until the waterline symbol is at the 5 degrees pitch line, then bank the aircraft 20 degrees left. Very good, now hold it there and enable the autopilot, either by clicking on the AP button, or by pressing A on the keyboard. Great, the UFC top line should display APATT. Also, a green AP light should illuminate on the caution panel next to the right MPD. Release the flight stick and the aircraft should maintain the flight attitude, climbing on the 5 degrees pitch line and turning left bank 20 degrees. Please note that the UFC has automatically opened the autopilot menu, to be ready in case you intend to enable one of the advanced modes of the autopilot. Press spacebar to continue. The pilot has 3 ways to disengage the autopilot at any moment, irrespective of which mode is engaged. Press the paddle switch on the control stick. Press the AP button on the UFC. Or press the A key binding. The autopilot will also disengage if the aircraft exceeds its limits, 60 degrees bank, 55 degrees, if using radar altitude, or 45 degrees of pitch. Try it, disconnect the autopilot now, using any of the above alternatives. Good, note that the UFC top line displays AP off, and the green AP light has gone off. Now level the aircraft, retrim if needed, and maintain a speed of 400 to 450 knots, so that we can keep trying other modes of the autopilot. Pitch attitude hold mode. To try this mode, hold the stick a bit until the waterline symbol is at the 10 degrees pitch line, while keeping the wings level. Good, hold it there and re-enable the autopilot, either by clicking on the AP button, or by pressing A on the keyboard. Very good, the UFC top line should display APHDG, and the green AP light is on. Release the flight stick and the aircraft should maintain both the 10 degrees climb and whichever heading you are on at the moment of the AP engagement. Press spacebar to continue. Note that as we climb, the aircraft loses speed. This occurs because the autopilot does not have command of the throttle, it can only operate the flight control surfaces. So, you must manually increase the throttle when climbing, and reduce it when descending, to keep the airspeed under control. Currently, you instructed the autopilot to climb, therefore you need to increase throttle. For this training flight, strive to keep the airspeed between 400 to 450 knots. Press spacebar to continue. The autopilot can also be set to hold the current altitude, and there are two ways of enabling this mode. One way if the AP is already active, and another way when the AP is not yet active. As the autopilot is currently active, in pitch attitude mode, we will simply enable the Alt-Hold option of the AP menu by pressing push button 3. Do it now. Good. The asterisk prefixed to the Alt-Hold option indicates that altitude hold is now active, and the aircraft will cease the climb and level out at our current altitude. The top visor line of the UFC should display AP Alt. Remember to please note that the push button 4, baro radar option, for selecting barometric or radar altitude, has no effect on the altitude hold mode, as the autopilot will simply maintain whichever altitude the aircraft was flying at. Also, note that the Alt-Hold selection will not disengage on its own, and will remain active even if the autopilot mode changes. It is therefore a good habit to always check its status before switching AP modes. Press spacebar to continue. Okay, we will now see how to enable the altitude hold mode when the autopilot is not already active. So, I have disconnected the AP and returned the UFC to its normal main menu. In order to notice the effect of the autopilot mode, place the aircraft on a slight descent. Remember to reduce the throttle when descending, to avoid increasing the aircraft's speed. You can see, next to push button 9, that the autopilot is off. Press PB9 to call up the UFC autopilot menu. Next, select the Alt-Hold option of the autopilot menu. The autopilot is still off, but the asterisk next to Alt-Hold tells us that the altitude hold option is now enabled. Now, you can proceed to enable the autopilot, either by pressing the AP button, or by pressing A on the keyboard. Good, the autopilot is now enabled. The top UFC line should display AP Alt and the aircraft should level out at the current altitude. Remember to adjust the throttles to keep the speed in limits. Press spacebar to continue. Altitude select mode. The last of the autopilot basic modes, this function provides the capability to automatically climb or descend to attain a selected radar or barometric altitude. Employing radar altitude is practical only when flying over water, as using it over land will have the aircraft constantly climbing and descending, as it attempts to follow the ground profile. The first step for this mode is to type in the scratchpad the desired altitude, between 1,000 and 50,000 feet. If the entry is between 10 and 50, it will get multiplied by 100 by the autopilot. Let's try this mode by entering 25000 using the UFC numeric keypad. Next, enter the value into the system by pressing push button 8. Good, the entered value is shown next to PB8. You can choose either barometric or radar altitude as basis for system calculations by pressing PB4. For this flight, make sure to select baro, as we are flying over land. If the selected altitude would place the aircraft below 1,000 feet AGL, the altitude source, PB4, would momentarily display baro, and then revert to RDR. An asterisk appears next to Alt Select and AP Alt is displayed on the top line of UFC. The aircraft will then begin to climb or descend to attain the selected altitude. Adjust the throttle accordingly. The highlighted field displays the minimum airspeed or Mach needed for the climb requested. In descent, only airspeed is displayed. The climb or descent rate should be controlled by the pilot, manually adjusting the throttle. Press spacebar to continue. Good, the aircraft should now be ascending towards an altitude of 25,000 feet, barometric. If it is not ascending, make sure that your speed is higher than the one indicated on the highlighted visor. If you want, you can now accelerate the simulated time with the keys, left Control Z, while we wait for the aircraft to ascend to Angels 25. We are about to reach 25,000 feet, so we have disabled the accelerated time mode. Note how the aircraft will level out by itself, without pilot intervention. Press spacebar once the aircraft has stabilized at the selected altitude. Remember to adjust the throttle to maintain airspeed. So far, we have covered all of the basic autopilot modes. We will now review the more advanced navigation coupled AP modes, not all of which have been implemented yet. It is important to note that all of the coupled modes require the master computer to be in navigation master mode. Press the highlighted button to switch to that mode now. Good, now I've turned off the autopilot and unselected all of its options, in anticipation to trying the coupled modes. I have also opened the HSI on the right MPD, and left the TSI on the central MPCD, as we will use those screens during navigation. Press spacebar to continue. In nav coupled mode, the autopilot will fly the currently selected route, following the sequence points in order. To be able to enter the nav coupled mode, the nav steering mode has to be selected, boxed, on the HSI. As nav steering is the default navigation mode, you can see on the HSI that nav is already boxed, and also its auto seek option is boxed too, to have the navigation automatically advance through the steer point sequence. Press spacebar to continue. On the UFC, press push button 9 to display the autopilot menu. The second display line on the UFC should show STR mode nav. This means that the steering mode nav option is available to use. Click on its adjacent push button 2 to select it. Good, an asterisk now prefixes it, to denote that this option is selected. Next, press the AP button to enable the autopilot on nav coupled mode. The UFC top line now shows AP nav status, and the aircraft should have started to turn towards the selected steer point. On the HSI, an AP indication has appeared, to indicate that the autopilot is active for navigation. On the HUD, the ANAV legend is now displayed, to denote that the nav coupled mode is active. Press spacebar to continue. It is possible to command the AP to maintain altitude by pressing push button 3, do it now. An asterisk appears next to the Alt Hold option, and the top UFC line displays AP Nav Alt. The aircraft will now keep its altitude while flying towards the selected steer point. It is also possible to choose the desired cruise altitude, in the same manner as we previously did when using basic altitude select mode, but we won't be repeating that now, in order to keep the training short. Press spacebar to continue. The selected steer point should be STR-1A, steer point 1, which can be quite far away from our current position. Examine the TSD map on the MPCD, and adjust its range until you can see both our aircraft and all of our route. Determine which one is the closest steer point, for example let's say it's steer point 3. To have it selected as out next waypoint, first press the menu button on the UFC, to display its main menu. Good, now type the number of the desired steer point on the scratch pad, for example 3. Finally, press push button 10 to make it the selected nav steer point. The aircraft should turn again, towards this newly selected steer point. In the same way as we previously did, you can now accelerate the simulated time with the keys, left Control plus Z, while we wait for the aircraft to reach the steer point. We are about to reach the steer point, so we have disabled the accelerated time mode. Note how the aircraft will turn by itself, without pilot intervention, to fly towards the next steer point in the sequence. Press spacebar once the aircraft has stabilized. Remember to adjust the throttle to maintain airspeed. The heading select coupled mode allows the aircrew to enter a selected heading for the autopilot to acquire and hold. Once the desired heading is entered and coupled, the aircraft rolls to the selected heading, using a standard turn rate of 30 degrees bank angle or 3 degree per second max turn rate. Once the heading is achieved, the heading select mode remains selected. I've turned off the autopilot and unselected all of its options, in anticipation to trying this heading select coupled mode. To use this autopilot mode, you have to select heading steer mode on the HSI. Press PB3 until HDG is boxed, indicating that the heading mode is now enabled. Press spacebar to continue once it's boxed. Next, you need to input the desired heading. For this exercise we will use a 90 degrees heading, type 90 on the UFC scratchpad. Now, press PB1 or PB2 to copy the scratchpad value onto the HSI heading field. Good, the heading field is now set to 90 degrees. Press spacebar to continue. Next, on the UFC, open the autopilot menu by clicking on the push button 9. The second display line on the UFC should show STR mode HDG. This means that the steering mode heading option is available to use. Click on its adjacent button PB2 to select it. Good, an asterisk now prefixes it, to denote that this option is selected. Next, press the AP button, or the A key, to enable the autopilot on heading select coupled mode. The UFC top line now shows AP AHDG status, and the aircraft should have started to turn towards the selected heading. On the HSI, the AP indication has appeared again, and the command heading marker is set on the 90 degrees bearing. On the HUD, the AHDG 090 legend is now displayed, to denote that the HDG coupled mode is active for 90 degrees. A vertical steering line is also shown. Press spacebar to continue. As on the previous nav mode, it is possible to command the autopilot to maintain altitude by pressing PB3, do it now. An asterisk appears next to the Alt-Hold option, and the top UFC line displays AP AHDG Alt. The aircraft will now keep its altitude while flying towards the selected heading. In the same way as we previously did, you can now accelerate the simulated time with the keys left Ctrl plus Z, while we wait for the aircraft to finish its turn. We are about to reach the selected heading, so we have disabled the accelerated time mode. Press spacebar once the aircraft has stabilized on a 90 degrees heading. We have completed training for the first two navigation coupled modes, inertial navigation steering, and heading steering. The not yet implemented autopilot modes are ground track steering. It will be similar to the heading steering mode, but with compensation for any crosswinds. Tack and steering. It will allow approaching, or leaving, a tack-in station, following a given radial bearing. Course steering. It will work in the same way as tack and steering mode, with the difference that the reference point is the currently selected steer point, instead of a tack-in station. This completes the autopilot training mission. You can press spacebar to end the mission now.